Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information provided in this comprehensive masterclass is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. We are diving deep into complex intersections of family law, personal finance, real estate, and long-term wealth preservation. However, nothing discussed here today constitutes formal legal, financial, tax, or professional advisory services. The landscape of asset division, demographic trends, and legal statutes varies considerably across different jurisdictions within the United States. Viewers are strongly cautioned to conduct their own rigorous due diligence and to consult with licensed professionals, such as certified financial planners, family law attorneys, and tax specialists, before making any irreversible life choices. Your financial future is your own responsibility, and the historical trends we analyze today do not dictate individual results. Right now, an unprecedented financial and social shockwave is quietly dismantling the traditional American retirement dream, and it is entirely self-inflicted. We are witnessing a demographic phenomenon so profound that economists and sociologists have coined terms specifically to describe its devastation. If you thought the greatest threat to a secure future was market volatility, inflation, or global economic instability, you are looking in the wrong direction. The single greatest destroyer of wealth in the United States today is a sudden, accelerating phenomenon known as the divorce now urgency, specifically sweeping through demographics that were previously thought to be immune to such sudden upheaval. Consider this staggering reality. Since the 1990s, while the overall national divorce rate has actually seen a gradual decline due to younger generations delaying marriage, the divorce rate for Americans over the age of 50 has absolutely skyrocketed. It has doubled. For those over the age of 65, it has tripled. This is not just a shift in romantic preferences. It is a systemic financial restructuring of the American middle and upper middle classes that leaves a trail of economic devastation in its wake. Every single week, approximately 15,000 married couples over the age of 50 in the United States look at their decades of shared history, their nearly paid-off mortgages, their blended retirement accounts, and they decide to call it quits. But the urgency, the sudden rush to the courthouse that legal professionals are experiencing right now, is driven by a terrifying mathematical reality that most people do not understand until it is far too late. When a midlife or late-stage divorce occurs, the financial destruction is swift and merciless. Historical data and recent economic analyses reveal that an individual's accumulated wealth drops by an average of 50% almost overnight. But the standard of living plunge is where the true horror lies. Studies tracking the aftermath of late-stage marital dissolution demonstrate that women experience a staggering 45% drop in their standard of living, while men experience a 21% decline. These are not just temporary setbacks. Because these individuals are closer to the end of their peak earning years, the event horizon to recover this lost wealth is virtually non-existent. You cannot simply work an extra 20 years to rebuild a retirement portfolio that took 3 decades to compound. Let us examine the step-by-step progression of this demographic shift to understand exactly how we arrived at this critical juncture. First, we must look at the widening educational divide in marital stability. Decades of data show that marriages are becoming increasingly stratified by class and education. Adults with a bachelor's degree or higher have a significantly lower probability of experiencing a divorce compared to those with only a high school diploma. This means that economic stability and marital stability are becoming dangerously intertwined. Second, we have the delayed marriage phenomenon. Couples who wait until their late 20s or early 30s to marry are showing remarkable resilience, dropping their risk of divorce dramatically. Yet, the overall marriage rate is plummeting, meaning that the pool of married individuals is older, wealthier, and theoretically more stable. So why the sudden, frantic rush to divorce among these very demographics? Despite these catastrophic potential outcomes, the urgency to file for divorce right now is accelerating. The underlying demographics of the United States have fundamentally altered the perceived risks of staying in an incompatible marriage. We are looking at a generation that is living significantly longer than their parents. An individual who is 55 years old today might easily be staring down 3 or 4 more decades of life. The prospect of spending another 30 years in a state of quiet desperation, unresolved conflict, or fundamental incompatibility is pushing people to prioritize personal fulfillment over financial preservation. Furthermore, the modern economic landscape, characterized by wildly inflated real estate valuations and shifting retirement mechanics, has created a bizarre psychological incentive. There is a pervasive fear that if you do not split the assets now, While the housing market is historically high and retirement accounts are ostensibly robust, you might miss the optimal window to fund two separate lives. This has created a frantic scramble, a race to liquidate shared histories before the next potential economic downturn traps couples together indefinitely under the weight of negative equity or crashed portfolios. People are gambling their entire financial safety nets, often without comprehending the sheer gravity of the structural disadvantages they will face as single individuals in an economy designed for dual-income households. The single-payer penalty for housing, healthcare, and basic utilities rapidly devours the halved assets. We are seeing case studies of individuals who traded a comfortable, shared retirement in a 4-bedroom suburban home for a precarious existence in a rented apartment, constantly terrified of outliving their diminished nest egg. The poverty rate for women over the age of 63, who go through a gray divorce, sits at an alarming 27%. That is 9 times higher than their married counterparts. These statistics represent a silent crisis of Americans choosing between critical healthcare and basic groceries, entirely because they misunderstood the hidden costs of dividing a life in half. They leaped toward freedom without realizing the parachute was designed for 2 people, not 1. This masterclass is designed to be the ultimate antidote to that dangerous lack of understanding. Today, we are decoding the exact mechanisms of this demographic shift and addressing the very specific problem this creates for the American audience: the dangerous gap between the emotional desire for immediate independence and the harsh financial reality of achieving it safely. The problem we are solving is the blind walk into economic devastation that so many well-intentioned individuals undertake when they feel the urgency to dissolve their marriages without a mathematically sound exit strategy. By the end of this deep dive, you will possess a comprehensive, step-by-step understanding of the historical trends, the macroeconomic forces, and the granular financial mechanics that define modern marital separation in the United States. You will be equipped to look past the emotional turmoil and analyze your situation with the cold, calculating precision required to survive this transition. We are going to map out the exact sequence of events that occurs when a household fractures, providing you with a clear-eyed view of potential outcomes rather than relying on the idealized, consequence-free narratives sold by popular culture and social media. You will learn how changing demographics, such as the shifting earning power dynamics between genders, the profound impact of delayed family formation, and the rise of the financially independent spouse, are rewriting the rules of asset protection. This is not about assigning blame or discouraging anyone from making necessary, life-saving changes. Rather, it is about radical preparation. We will explore detailed case studies that illustrate how the timing of a divorce, specifically in relation to economic cycles, real estate market peaks, and age brackets, dictates the long-term survival of your portfolio. You will see exactly how one miscalculation regarding spousal support or the division of a pension can echo through the next 30 years of your life. You are going to discover the unseen financial landmines that family law attorneys and financial planners see detonating every single day. We will systematically break down the catastrophic tax implications of hastily liquidating retirement accounts, the harsh realities of attempting to refinance a marital home in a fluctuating interest rate environment, and the terrifying cost of securing individual health insurance late in life. Furthermore, we will detail step-by-step how to accurately project your post-separation standard of living, ensuring that you are utilizing realistic, inflation-adjusted data rather than optimistic guesswork. You will learn to audit your own life, identifying which assets are truly liquid and which are traps disguised as wealth. By thoroughly examining the intersection of changing demographics and the current economic climate, this presentation will empower you to make decisions rooted in empirical evidence and strategic foresight. Whether you are currently navigating these turbulent legal waters, contemplating a massive life transition in the near future, or simply seeking to understand the tectonic social shifts reshaping the American middle class, the insights provided here are critical. They will equip you with the knowledge required to protect your legacy, anticipate legal hurdles before they materialize, and fundamentally secure your financial independence against the most common, yet least understood, wealth-destroying event of our time. You will no longer be flying blind, relying on anecdotal advice from well-meaning friends. You will have the blueprint, the data, and the historical context to understand the divorce now urgency, allowing you to protect yourself, your children, and your hard-earned future in an increasingly volatile demographic landscape. To truly comprehend the depth of this crisis, we have to look at the massive demographic engines driving it. The first major engine is the sheer mathematical reality of the baby boomer generation, and the older edge of Generation X moving into a completely unprecedented phase of life. Let us look at a case study that mirrors thousands of households across the United States in 2026. Imagine a couple named Robert and Susan, living in a suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta, Georgia. They married in their mid-20s, built a life together over 34 years, raised 2 children who have now fully transitioned into adulthood, and successfully paid down a significant portion of their 30-year fixed mortgage. On paper, Robert and Susan represent the pinnacle of American domestic stability. They have a combined net worth tied up in their primary residence, 2 employer-sponsored 401k plans, and mutual funds. Historically, couples like Robert and Susan would coast through their late 50s and 60s, looking forward to shared retirement travel and grandparenthood. But the demographic landscape of 2026 has introduced an entirely new variable into their marital equation: extended life expectancy combined with the erosion of the traditional retirement safety net. When Robert and Susan look at their own parents, they see a generation that frequently experienced rapid physical decline shortly after leaving the workforce. However, modern medical advancements, a societal shift toward health and wellness, and the transition away from physically grueling manufacturing labor to sedentary knowledge work mean that Robert and Susan can reasonably expect to live well into their 80s or 90s. This realization creates a massive psychological and financial shock. Susan looks across the kitchen table and realizes that if she remains in a marriage that has felt emotionally hollow or subtly toxic for the last decade, she is not just sacrificing a few years, she is committing to 25, 30, or even 35 more years of shared existence. The perceived cost of staying suddenly outweighs the perceived cost of leaving. This shift in longevity changes the entire timeline of human relationships. In the past, the societal contract of marriage was heavily supported by a shorter post-child-rearing lifespan. Today, the empty nest phase of a marriage can easily last just as long as the active parenting phase. When the children move out, couples are forced into a prolonged face-to-face confrontation with each other, stripped of the daily distractions, schedules, and shared goals of child-rearing. For Robert and Susan, the sudden quiet of their large suburban home highlights a profound ideological and emotional rift that was hidden for decades beneath the noise of soccer practices, school plays, and career building. Simultaneously, we must examine the shifting financial independence of women within this specific demographic. Historical trends show that over the past 4 decades, women's participation in the labor force has not only increased in raw numbers, but their earning potential and asset accumulation have reached historic highs. In many modern households navigating midlife, the female spouse is either the primary earner or possesses a robust, independent career trajectory. In our case study, Susan is a senior project manager at a regional logistics firm, possessing her own employer-sponsored retirement account and a distinct professional identity. This financial autonomy completely rewrites the historical playbook of divorce. In previous generations, a woman in her late 50s might have felt economically trapped in an unhappy marriage due to a lack of independent credit history, minimal personal savings, and the absence of a marketable resume. In 2026, that structural barrier has largely dissolved for a significant portion of the population. Susan does not need to stay for survival. She has the financial capacity to walk away. However, this newfound autonomy collides violently with the mechanical realities of American family law and asset division, creating a state of extreme urgency. When a couple decides to dissolve a marriage after 3 decades, they are not just splitting a bank account. They are attempting to surgically separate a deeply intertwined financial ecosystem. In the United States, asset division is governed by state laws, which generally fall into 2 categories: community property states and equitable distribution states. In a community property state like California or Texas, assets acquired during the marriage are typically split 50-50 down the middle, regardless of who earned the money or whose name is on the account. In an equitable distribution state, which covers the majority of the country, the court attempts to divide property in a manner that is fair and just, taking into many factors such as the duration of the marriage, the earning capacity of each party, and the health and age of the individuals. Let us map out the step-by-step destruction of Robert and Susan's net worth under an equitable distribution framework to see why legal professionals are experiencing a frantic rush of clients trying to beat the clock. Step 1 is the comprehensive asset valuation. This involves hiring forensic accountants, real estate appraisers, and actuarial experts to determine the exact cash value of every single item owned by the marital estate. The primary residence, which purchased decades ago for $200,000, might now be appraised at $750,000 in the current 2026 real estate market. On paper, this looks like a massive win. But to extract that equity, the home must either be sold, or one spouse must buy out the other's share. If Robert wants to keep the house, he must secure a new mortgage to pay Susan her $375,000 share of the equity. This triggers step 2, the financing nightmare. In the macroeconomic environment of 2026, interest rates for residential mortgages are vastly higher than the historical lows seen in the previous decade. Robert is forced to surrender a grandfather 2.5% interest rate on their original joint mortgage and take on a new, solo mortgage at a significantly higher rate. Suddenly, the monthly payment to maintain the exact same physical structure doubles, devouring a massive percentage of his solo post-divorce income. If neither can afford to buy out the other, the house must be placed on the market. The sale triggers transaction costs, agent fees, and potential capital gains taxes that immediately erode the total equity pool available to both parties. Step 3 is the carving up of the retirement accounts. This is where the most devastating long-term wealth destruction occurs. A 401k or an IRA cannot simply be split by withdrawing cash and handing it to the other spouse. Doing so would trigger catastrophic early withdrawal penalties and massive income tax liabilities. Instead, the legal system must utilize a highly specialized instrument known as a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or a QDRO. This legal directive instructs the plan administrator to split the retirement account into 2 separate, independent accounts without triggering immediate tax penalties. While the QDRO protects against immediate tax penalties, it cannot protect against the loss of compounding efficiency. Imagine if Robert and Susan had a combined $1 million in a joint wealth management strategy, compounding at an average rate of 7% annually. When that $1 million is violently severed into 2 $500,000 accounts, and those accounts are then managed independently with separate fee structures, different risk tolerances, and localized investment strategies, the long-term wealth generation potential changes dramatically. Each individual is now operating with half the capital base, trying to fund a solo retirement that carries nearly the same fixed overhead costs as their previous joint life. They have effectively doubled their cost of living while having their asset base. This structural fragmentation explains the sheer panic driving the divorce now urgency across the United States. Individuals are looking at the looming economic horizons of the late 2020s, realizing that the margin for error is shrinking to zero. If they wait another 5 years, a market correction could decimate their shared portfolio, leaving them with even less capital to split, or health issues could arise that legally obligate one spouse to support the care of the other indefinitely. The window to exit with enough capital to reconstruct a viable, independent life is closing fast, forcing thousands to make sudden, high-stakes decisions today. But what happens when the legal battle lines are officially drawn, and the true cost of litigation begins to consume the very wealth people are fighting to protect? What are the hidden legal traps that turn a civilized separation into an economic scorched earth scenario? We will explore exactly how the architecture of the legal system can transform a routine asset split into a wealth-devouring trap in the next part of our masterclass. To understand how a routine asset division transforms into an absolute wealth-devouring trap, we must pull back the curtain on the actual mechanics of the American adversarial legal system. When a couple enters the family court system with a sense of urgency, they often assume the process is a straightforward mathematical equation handled by objective professionals. In reality, the architecture of domestic litigation is structurally designed to consume liquidity. Let us look at a case study reflecting the ground reality in 2026. Imagine a business professional named David and his spouse, Linda, who have been married for 28 years and reside in a high-growth metropolitan area like Phoenix, Arizona. They built a successful commercial printing business from scratch, owned entirely by the marital estate, which generates a highly stable annual revenue. When the decision to divorce is finalized, David and Linda both hire prominent local family law practitioners, assuming that their shared desire for a swift resolution will keep costs low. This is where the first structural trap snaps shut, the billable hour alignment problem. In the United States, family law attorneys typically bill by fractions of an hour, often in 6-minute increments, with hourly rates in major metropolitan areas routinely ranging from $400 to $800 per hour in 2026. The adversarial nature of the court system means that every single communication, every email notification, every telephone call, and every piece of formal documentation exchanged between David's counsel and Linda's counsel incurs a bilateral expense. Imagine if Linda's attorney spends 2 hours drafting a formal request for 5 years of corporate tax records. David's attorney must spend 2 hours reviewing the request, another 3 hours conferring with David and his corporate accountant, and 2 more hours drafting the formal response. Before a single piece of paper is actually filed with the clerk of the court, the marital estate has shed thousands of dollars in pure administrative friction. Now imagine if an emotional dispute arises over an item with minimal intrinsic financial value, such as a collection of family heirlooms or the rights to a timeshare property. If both parties refuse to compromise due to the intense emotional volatility inherent in a late-stage marital dissolution, the attorneys are legally obligated to litigate the issue. A 3-hour deposition regarding the historical acquisition of personal property can easily cost the estate more than the actual replacement value of the items in question. Historical trends show that high-conflict divorces involving mid to high net worth individuals can quickly consume between 10 and 15% of the total marital estate, purely in legal fees, expert witness costs, and court expenditures. The second wealth-devouring mechanism is the temporary support order process, known legally in many jurisdictions as pendant light relief. When David and Linda separate physically, the court must ensure that the lower-earning spouse can maintain a standard of living roughly approximating the status quo during the months or years the litigation drags on. If Linda has spent the last decade managing the household while David ran the commercial printing operation, Linda's counsel will immediately file a motion for temporary spousal support in suit money, which is a court order demanding that David pay for Linda's legal representation out of the primary business revenue. Suddenly, David is not only funding his own legal defense, but he is legally compelled to fund the very legal team attempting to dismantle his business assets. This introduces a massive cash flow crisis. The business must continue to operate, pay suppliers, meet payroll, and maintain capital reserves, while simultaneously absorbing a double drain of personal legal fees and temporary support payments. If the cash flow cannot sustain this pressure, David may be forced to take out high-interest commercial loans or liquidate capital investments at a disadvantageous time, permanently damaging the long-term viability and valuation of the enterprise. Step by step, the discovery phase further accelerates this financial bleeding. In a deep-dive asset dissection, both legal teams will demand a comprehensive disclosure of all historical financial records, including bank statements, credit card histories, investment portfolios, cryptocurrency wallets, and real estate deeds. If one party suspects the other of hiding assets or wasting marital funds on non-marital endeavors, they will employ a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant charges an independent hourly rate to meticulously audit thousands of pages of ledger sheets, tracing the flow of every single dollar over a multi-year period. While this process is vital for ensuring an equitable distribution, the fee for a comprehensive forensic audit can easily reach tens of thousands of dollars. If the audit ultimately reveals no hidden assets, that capital is permanently gone, entirely unrecoverable, leaving both parties with a smaller final pool of wealth to divide. Furthermore, the statutory timelines of American family courts act as an institutional drag on efficiency. Due to massive case backlogs in family law divisions across the country in 2026, a standard contested divorce can take anywhere from 12 to 24 months to reach a final trial. During this prolonged period of legal limbo, the marital assets are essentially frozen by automatic temporary restraining orders. Neither David nor Linda can sell real estate, alter the beneficiaries on their life insurance policies, rebalance their investment portfolios, or make major corporate decisions without the express written consent of the other party or a specific order from the judge. Imagine if a major market shift occurs during this freeze. If the tech sector experiences a sudden correction, or the local real estate market dips, David and Linda are legally paralyzed. They cannot reallocate their joint investments to safer capital preservation vehicles because the legal machinery prevents unilateral asset management. They are forced to watch their shared net worth fluctuate wildly, powerless to execute standard wealth protection protocols due to the ongoing litigation. This structural vulnerability is why the urgency to settle quickly often turns into a desperate race against macroeconomic conditions. Case studies show that the psychological wear and tear of this prolonged financial exposure eventually leads to a phenomenon known as litigation fatigue. After 18 months of constant document production, deposition testimonies, and mounting legal bills, individuals frequently reach a breaking point where they agree to highly unfavorable settlement terms simply to bring the financial hemorrhage to an end. They surrender valuable long-term assets, such as a future share of a corporate pension or a balanced portion of real estate equity, in exchange for immediate closure. This desperate capitulation represents the ultimate failure of a wealth protection strategy, as the individual sacrifices their long-term economic security to escape the immediate administrative nightmare of the court system. But what happens when the legal system finally finishes carving up the estate, and the remaining assets are handed over to the newly single individuals? This is where the silent, systemic weapon of the modern tax code manifests itself, waiting to penalize the unprepared. The division of real estate, the transfer of corporate shares, and the restructuring of alimony carry massive internal tax traps that can instantly turn a seemingly fair settlement into a financial disaster. How do the changing 2026 tax frameworks specifically penalize individuals who rush through their asset division without anticipating the Internal Revenue Service's next move? We will expose the hidden tax traps that can quietly dissolve your remaining net worth in the next part of our masterclass. When the dust settles on the courthouse steps and the judge officially signs the final decree, most individuals breathe a sigh of relief, mistakenly believing the financial hemorrhaging has finally stopped. They look at their newly divided assets on a spreadsheet and assume that a $500,000 retirement account is precisely equal to $500,000 in home equity. This is the single most destructive illusion in modern family law, and it is entirely fueled by a dangerous ignorance of the United States tax code. The Internal Revenue Service does not view all assets equally. If you finalize your divorce in 2026 without understanding the deeply embedded tax liabilities attached to your specific settlement, you are essentially walking into a financial minefield completely blindfolded. Let us meticulously break down the primary tax traps that quietly dissolve the remaining net worth of newly single Americans, starting with the illusion of equal asset division. Imagine a couple, Michael and Sarah, finalizing their divorce in the current 2026 economic climate. They agree to what looks like a perfectly equitable 50-50 split of a $1 million marital estate. Michael takes the $500,000 currently sitting in a traditional 401k account, and Sarah takes the $500,000 located in a joint brokerage account filled with municipal bonds and already taxed cash. On paper, it looks fair and mathematically balanced, but the reality is that Michael just accepted a massive, hidden tax liability while Sarah walked away with pure, unencumbered liquidity. Because Michael's 401k is funded entirely with pre-tax dollars, every single penny he eventually withdraws to fund his retirement will be subject to ordinary income tax rates. If we factor in the combined burden of state and federal taxes, Michael's actual usable wealth from that account might only be around $350,000. Sarah, on the other hand, possesses post-tax assets. Her $500,000 is truly $500,000. Michael fell into the pre-tax trap because his legal team focused exclusively on the gross valuation of the estate rather than the net, after-tax realization of the assets. The second wealth-destroying mechanism revolves around the primary residence and the catastrophic miscalculation of capital gains tax exclusions. In the modern real estate market, massive property appreciation over the last decade has left many couples sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in unrealized home equity. Let us look at a highly common scenario. Imagine if a husband and wife purchased a home in Seattle a decade ago for $400,000. Today, that home is appraised at $1.2 million, granting them $800,000 in pure equity. Under the United States tax code, a married couple filing jointly can exclude up to $500,000 of capital gains profit from the sale of their primary residence. If they sell the house together before finalizing the divorce, they pay capital gains taxes only on the remaining $300,000 of profit. But watch exactly what happens when the divorce now urgency takes over, and they make a critical sequencing error. Imagine if the wife decides she desperately wants to keep the house to maintain geographic stability for their teenage children. She buys out the husband's share using other marital assets, such as surrendering her claim to his pension, and the home is transferred solely into her name. 3 years later, the sheer cost of maintaining the property, paying the skyrocketing property taxes, and funding the upkeep as a single earner becomes mathematically impossible. She is forced to sell. Because she is now a single taxpayer, her capital gains exclusion has been statutorily slashed in half, dropping from $500,000 to just $250,000. When she sells the home for $1.2 million, she is suddenly hit with a massive capital gains tax bill on $550,000 of profit. The emotional decision to delay the sale and transition the property into a single name effectively evaporated a huge portion of her underlying wealth entirely through an avoidable, structural tax exposure. Let us examine another highly specific trap involving the division of employer-sponsored retirement plans. As we discussed previously, a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, is the legal instrument used to divide these assets without triggering immediate penalties. But a QDRO contains a hidden loophole that is frequently misunderstood and disastrously misused by individuals desperate for immediate cash. When a QDRO is executed, the receiving spouse has a unique, one-time opportunity to take a direct cash distribution from the newly divided 401k without paying the standard 10% early withdrawal penalty, regardless of their age. The sheer temptation of this immediate liquidity is overwhelming for individuals facing the massive upfront costs of setting up a new independent life. Imagine if David receives $200,000 from his ex-wife's 401k via a QDRO. He desperately needs $50,000 to secure a lease on a new apartment, buy furniture, and cover his mounting legal retainers. He utilizes the QDRO loophole to withdraw the $50,000 penalty-free. He thinks he has outsmarted the system by avoiding the 10% hit. But while the penalty is waived, the ordinary income tax is absolutely not. That $50,000 withdrawal is immediately stacked on top of his regular earned income for the 2026 tax year. If David earns $80,000 a year at his primary job, this sudden withdrawal pushes his gross income to $130,000, potentially bumping him into a significantly higher marginal tax bracket. When tax season arrives, David is hit with a devastating bill that he absolutely cannot pay because he already spent the cash on rent and lawyers. He utilized a tax loophole without understanding the macroeconomic consequence, effectively trading a long-term compound growth asset for a short-term, highly taxed liability. The final major trap involves the fundamental rewiring of spousal support taxation. Historically, the spouse paying alimony could deduct those payments from their taxable income, which provided a massive incentive for the higher earner to agree to generous support packages. The receiving spouse would then claim those payments as taxable income, usually at a much lower tax bracket. But the landscape of spousal support was fundamentally altered by recent tax legislation. For any divorce agreement executed after December 31, 2018, and continuing firmly through the current tax year, alimony payments are no longer tax deductible for the payer, and they are no longer considered taxable income for the recipient. This is a monumental shift in the mechanics of financial negotiation. Plus one. Imagine if a high-earning spouse in 2026 agrees to pay $5,000 a month in spousal support, assuming they will receive a lucrative tax deduction at the end of the year, just like their divorced peers did a decade ago. They are in for a brutal awakening. That $60,000 a year must be paid using purely after-tax dollars. To generate $60,000 in spendable cash, the paying spouse might actually need to earn close to $100,000 in gross income, depending on their specific state and federal tax brackets. This absolute elimination of the alimony deduction means that the true cost of supporting an ex-spouse has skyrocketed for the payer, fundamentally altering the calculus of what constitutes a sustainable settlement. If you base your post-divorce budget on outdated tax assumptions, you will find yourself in a severe unrecoverable cash flow deficit within the very first year of your new life. These complex tax traps illustrate exactly why the emotional desire to rush the process can lead to decades of financial regret. Every single transfer of property, every liquidation of an account, and every structural agreement regarding support must be relentlessly analyzed through the lens of current tax law. You cannot rely on a family law attorney to act as a certified public accountant. The failure to deploy a specialized financial team during the negotiation phase results in individuals inadvertently volunteering to pay tens of thousands of dollars in unnecessary taxes, simply because they did not understand the difference between gross valuation and net realization. But the devastation of a poorly planned separation does not stop at the tax level. Once the assets are divided and the tax traps have taken their toll, the newly single individual faces an even more insidious threat: the sheer, crushing reality of single-payer inflation. The macroeconomic environment of 2026 is brutally unforgiving to single-income households. From the structural penalty baked into basic utilities and groceries to the catastrophic cost of securing individual healthcare late in life, the mathematical transition from a shared economy to a solo economy breaks even the most robust budgets. How exactly does the modern economy penalize the single consumer? And what are the precise, hidden costs of living alone that devour the remaining post-divorce wealth? We will systematically break down the single-payer penalty and expose the terrifyingly high cost of basic survival, in the next part of our masterclass. When the legal machinery finally halts and the remaining assets are officially distributed, the newly single individual faces an even more insidious threat. This is the sheer, crushing reality of the single-payer penalty, often referred to by economists as the single tax. The macroeconomic environment of 2026 is brutally unforgiving to single-income households. From the structural penalty baked into basic utilities and groceries to the catastrophic cost of securing individual healthcare late in life, the mathematical transition from a shared economy to a solo economy breaks even the most robust budgets. To understand why historical trends show such a massive drop in the standard of living post-divorce, we must systematically dissect how the American consumer economy is fundamentally priced for two people, heavily penalizing anyone attempting to survive on their own. Let us look at a highly detailed case study to illustrate the mathematical violence of this transition. Imagine a 58-year-old mid-level executive named Karen, living in the suburbs of Chicago in 2026. Prior to her divorce, she and her husband shared a combined household income of $180,000. They shared a mortgage, a single internet bill, a unified utility infrastructure, and a joint auto insurance policy. When Karen finalized her divorce, she successfully negotiated a very fair settlement, walking away with significant cash reserves and a solid individual income of $90,000. On paper, she assumes her life will simply be cut in half, scaled down proportionally. But this is the exact mathematical fallacy that leads to widespread post-divorce poverty. The structural costs of existence do not divide themselves simply because your marital status changed. Consider the mechanics of housing, which represents the most devastating component of the single-payer penalty. In Karen's previous life, a $3,000 monthly mortgage payment essentially cost her $1,500, as it was absorbed by the joint household income. Now she must secure an independent living arrangement in the highly inflated 2026 real estate market. Whether she rents a luxury apartment or buys a smaller townhome, baseline entry costs for safe, reliable housing remains astronomically high. If her new solo rent is $2,000 a month, she is instantly paying $500 more per month than she did in her marriage, for significantly less square footage. Furthermore, the internet provider does not charge half price because only one person is using the router. The local municipality does not cut property taxes or trash collection fees in half for single residents. The electricity required to heat and cool a living space remains largely the same regardless of occupancy. Karen is now bearing 100% of the infrastructural overhead on 50% of her previous household income. This financial compression extends rapidly into the granular details of daily survival, specifically in the realm of groceries and consumer goods. We are living through an era of profound food inflation, and the grocery supply chain is explicitly optimized for family units. When Karen goes to the supermarket, she faces a hidden premium on almost everything she buys. Purchasing food in smaller, single-serving quantities is vastly more expensive per ounce than buying in bulk. However, if she attempts to buy the larger, more economical family sizes to save money, she inevitably faces a massive increase in food waste, as a single individual physically cannot consume perishable goods fast enough before they spoil. Historical data tracking single households reveals that solo dwellers spend approximately 30% more on food per person than those in two-person households. Over the course of a year, this invisible surcharge quietly devours thousands of dollars of disposable income that Karen had mentally allocated for her retirement savings. Beyond daily expenses, the single-payer penalty strikes with terrifying force in the insurance and healthcare sectors. During her marriage, Karen benefited from a highly subsidized family health insurance plan provided by her ex-husband's employer, which allowed them to pool their deductibles and minimize out-of-pocket maximums. Upon finalizing the divorce, she immediately loses access to that corporate safety net. She is forced to either utilize her own employer's potentially inferior plan or enter the individual healthcare marketplace. Individual health insurance premiums for a single woman in her late 50s are staggeringly high. Without a spouse to share the burden of unexpected medical emergencies or to provide basic at-home caretaking during an illness, the financial risk of a health crisis falls entirely on her solitary shoulders. This constant, looming threat often forces newly single individuals to purchase expensive supplemental insurance policies, further draining their monthly liquidity. The most permanent and irreversible aspect of this solo economy involves the complex regulations surrounding Social Security and long-term retirement benefits. The United States government has specific statutory requirements regarding spousal benefits that thousands of divorcing couples completely overlook in their rush to the courthouse. For instance, an individual is only entitled to claim Social Security benefits based on their ex-spouse's earnings record if the marriage lasted for exactly 10 years or longer. Imagine if a couple, overwhelmed by the divorce now urgency, finalizing their separation at the 9-year and 10-month mark. By failing to wait just 2 more months, the lower-earning spouse permanently forfeits their legal right to claim the potentially higher spousal benefit for the rest of their natural life. This single sequencing error, driven entirely by emotional impatience, can result in the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars in guaranteed government income during their most vulnerable twilight years. Economists and sociologists have meticulously quantified this standard of living plunge. Empirical studies demonstrate that a single individual actually needs to earn roughly 65% of a 2-person household's combined income just to maintain the exact same standard of living they enjoyed while married. But in a standard divorce scenario, the individual only retains 50% of the marital assets and whatever their solo income provides. This leaves a massive structural 15% deficit in their lifestyle maintenance. Every single month, they are mathematically falling behind, bleeding cash just to keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked. They cannot travel the way they used to, they cannot save at their previous velocity, and they must constantly monitor every financial decision with an exhausting level of hypervigilance. Faced with this terrifying monthly deficit, how do newly single Americans attempt to bridge the gap between their emotional expectations of a liberated life and the brutal mathematical reality of the single-payer penalty? When the cash flow dries up, the vast majority turn to the most dangerous financial instrument available to them, attempting to artificially prop up their old lifestyle. How exactly does the modern credit system exploit this vulnerability, turning a temporary cash flow problem into a permanent, inescapable debt spiral? We will dissect the psychological traps of post-divorce spending and the terrifying mechanics of compounding consumer debt in the next part of our masterclass. To understand how this catastrophic debt spiral begins, we must look at the powerful psychological phenomenon known as lifestyle inertia. When an individual spent 20 or 30 years accustomed to a certain socioeconomic status, their brain establishes that specific level of consumption as their baseline reality. They are habituated to dining at upscale restaurants on weekends, driving a late-model European luxury sedan, taking seasonal vacations, and maintaining a well-manicured aesthetic. When the divorce is finalized and their available liquidity is abruptly slashed by 50% or more, a violent cognitive dissonance occurs. The newly single individual feels a profound sense of shame or a desperate need to prove to their social circle, their ex-spouse, and themselves that they are still thriving. They refuse to downsize their life because doing so feels like a public admission of defeat. Let us examine a highly detailed case study that maps this psychological trap directly into the current economic climate of 2026. Imagine a 54-year-old regional sales director named Mark, residing in the high-cost-of-living suburbs of Austin, Texas. Post-divorce, Mark moves out of the 4-bedroom family home and leases a modern high-rise apartment downtown to signal his new chapter of independence. His solo salary is $120,000, which is an excellent income by objective metrics. However, after factoring in state and federal taxes, health insurance premiums as a single filer, and his newly decreed spousal support obligations, Mark's actual monthly take-home pay available for discretionary spending is heavily compressed. Instead of adjusting his behavior to match this new reality, Mark succumbs to lifestyle inertia. He looks at his empty apartment and immediately spends $15,000 on high-end furniture, putting the entire balance on a premium rewards credit card. He tells himself this is a necessary investment in his mental health and his new beginning. When his old friends invite him out to a high-end steakhouse, he readily agrees, footing an expensive bill to maintain the illusion that his financial capacity remains completely unchanged. When his vehicle lease ends, instead of downgrading to a practical, fuel-efficient sedan, he signs a new lease on a luxury SUV with a monthly payment that consumes a massive portion of his remaining solo income. Mark is running a massive monthly deficit, but because he has access to substantial credit lines that were established back when he was part of a wealthy dual-income household, the crisis remains completely invisible on the surface. This introduces step 1 of the post-divorce debt spiral, the transition from structural deficit to revolving credit reliance. Every single month, Mark's true cost of living exceeds his net take-home income by approximately $2,000. To bridge this gap, He quietly slides those everyday expenses onto his revolving credit cards. Groceries, utilities, fuel, and minor entertainment are all charged to plastic. In his mind, this is a temporary transitional phase. He tells himself that once he receives his annual corporate bonus or once the emotional volatility of the separation subsides, he will easily wipe out the balance. But he is ignoring the macroeconomic reality of 2026, where revolving consumer credit interest rates have plateaued at historic highs, routinely exceeding 21% annually. Step 2 is the devastating math of compounding interest working against a fixed solo income. By the end of the first year of his new solo life, Mark has accumulated $24,000 in revolving credit card debt purely from his monthly operational deficit, plus the initial $15,000 spent on furniture. His total balance sits at $39,000. At a 21% annual percentage rate, the interest charge alone begins to add nearly $700 a month to his balance. Suddenly, the debt is no longer just absorbing his lifestyle deficit. The debt itself has become a major, fixed monthly expense. Mark is now forced to make minimum payments that barely cover the accumulating interest, meaning his principal balance remains completely stagnant. He is running as fast as he can just to stay in the exact same place, and his monthly disposable income is squeezed even tighter. Step 3 is the inevitable arrival of the credit capacity ceiling and the subsequent pivot to high-risk capital extraction. After 18 months of running this deficit, Mark's credit cards approach their maximum limits. His credit score, which was once a pristine 800, begins to plummet due to high credit utilization ratios. The banks notice this risk profile shift and begin reducing his available credit lines or increasing his interest rates even further. Panic sets in. To prevent a public collapse of his lifestyle, Mark looks for alternative pools of capital to exploit. He turns to his employer-sponsored 401k plan, deciding to take out a maximum personal loan against his retirement balance. He rationalizes this choice by telling himself that he is simply borrowing from himself and paying the interest back to his own account. This is a dangerous trap. By extracting $50,000 from his 401k to pay off his high-interest credit cards, Mark temporarily resets his revolving debt to zero. He feels an immense sense of relief, but he has actually amplified his systemic risk. The 401k loan must be repaid through automatic payroll deductions over a strict 5-year timeline. This means his monthly take-home pay drops even further to service the loan principal. Even worse, if Mark faces a sudden corporate downsizing, a health crisis, or chooses to leave his job in 2026, the entire remaining balance of that 401k loan becomes immediately due and payable within a matter of weeks. If he cannot repay it instantly, the Internal Revenue Service classifies the outstanding balance as an early distribution, hitting him with massive ordinary income taxes and a 10% tax penalty, completely decimating his long-term retirement security. Furthermore, Mark's lifestyle inertia completely blinds him to the long-term historical trends of wealth accumulation. By spending his remaining capital to maintain a facade of midlife prosperity, he permanently forfeits the single most powerful financial tool available to human beings: compounding efficiency over time. Every single dollar he spends on a premium restaurant meal or an inflated luxury car lease is a dollar that cannot sit in a low-cost index fund compounding for the next 15 years. Because he is 54, his investment horizon is drastically shorter than that of a 25-year-old. He does not have the luxury of time to recover from these systemic leaks. His actions are effectively transferring wealth from his future elderly self to his current insecure self, ensuring that his eventual retirement will be characterized by severe material deprivation. This psychological trap is not unique to Mark. It is a pervasive demographic pattern unfolding across the United States. Thousands of newly single individuals are utilizing debt as an emotional shock absorber to cushion the brutal transition from a dual-income lifestyle to a single-income reality. They use consumer credit to buy happiness, validation, and a sense of normalcy in the wake of a deeply traumatic social uprooting. But the credit system is entirely indifferent to emotional trauma. It is a cold, mechanical calculator designed to extract maximum value from structural vulnerability. When you attempt to solve an emotional crisis with compounding consumer debt, the potential outcomes are universally catastrophic. As these personal debt bubbles expand across the country, they are beginning to coalesce into a much larger, systemic crisis that threatens to reshape the entire American macroeconomy. When hundreds of thousands of midlife individuals simultaneously decimate their retirement portfolios, max out their credit capacities, and compromise their long-term stability, the the consequences spill far beyond their individual households. We are looking at a looming structural shift that will fundamentally alter the future of the American housing market, the solvency of public safety nets, and the entire velocity of consumer spending. What happens when this massive wave of financially compromised, newly single individuals enters their retirement years with zero capital reserves? How will the upcoming demographic cliff completely destabilize the economic foundations of the nation? We will expose the terrifying macroeconomic endgame of the gray divorce epidemic in the next part of our masterclass. When hundreds of thousands of individual households simultaneously fracture under the financial weight of a late-stage divorce, the resulting economic devastation does not remain confined to the family court system. It aggressively spills out into the broader national economy, creating a massive localized shockwave that alters the very foundation of American fiscal stability. In the year 2026, the sheer volume of the gray divorce demographic has reached a critical mass, fundamentally transitioning this phenomenon from a private, emotional tragedy into a terrifying macroeconomic endgame. To comprehend the sheer scale of this impending disaster, we must elevate our perspective from the individual checking account to the structural pillars of the United States economy, specifically the housing market, the healthcare safety net, and the velocity of consumer spending. Let us first examine the unprecedented distortion this demographic shift is inflicting on the American housing market. Imagine a couple named Thomas and Patricia, residing in Columbus, Ohio. They are both 62 years old and have spent the last 2 decades aggressively paying down the mortgage on a spacious 4-bedroom suburban home. When their marriage officially dissolves in 2026, the court mandates the liquidation of this primary residence to equitably divide the accumulated equity. Under normal demographic conditions, Thomas and Patricia would have remained in that single structure, effectively occupying one unit of housing until the end of their natural lives. Instead, their divorce instantly creates an artificial, completely unanticipated demand for 2 separate, independent housing units. Now multiply Thomas and Patricia by the roughly 15,000 couples over the age of 50, who are finalizing their divorces every single week across the nation. This translates to an artificial demand surge of hundreds of thousands of new housing units required annually, specifically concentrated in the 1 to 2 bedroom apartment and affordable townhome sectors. This sudden influx of desperate, newly single buyers and renters is colliding violently with a historic shortage of affordable housing inventory. Because these divorced individuals are suddenly competing with younger generations, such as millennials and Generation Z, for the exact same entry-level properties, the ensuing bidding wars drive up rental rates and property valuations to unsustainable levels. Furthermore, individuals like Thomas, who are forced to surrender a historically low 3% mortgage rate from the previous decade, must now secure new financing at the vastly inflated interest rates of 2026. This mass transition from low-interest shared debt to high-interest solo debt permanently traps an enormous percentage of their remaining wealth in unproductive interest payments to commercial banks, directly starving the rest of the consumer economy. This brings us to the second pillar of the macroeconomic endgame, the catastrophic strain on public safety nets and the healthcare infrastructure. The American long-term care system is implicitly designed around the assumption that an elderly individual will have a spouse available to provide unpaid, in-home caregiving during a protracted illness. When a married individual falls ill, their spouse typically steps in to manage medication, assist with daily mobility, and handle basic domestic chores, effectively keeping the ailing partner out of the expensive institutional healthcare system for as long as possible. The gray divorce epidemic completely annihilates this implicit safety net. Imagine if Patricia, living alone in her new apartment post-divorce, suffers a severe stroke or receives a devastating cognitive diagnosis. She does not have a spouse down the hall to hear her fall. She does not have a dedicated partner to transport her to daily physical therapy sessions or manage a complex regime of medications. Because her adult children are already stretched to the breaking point managing their own careers and families, Patricia has no choice but to enter a professional, full-time assisted living facility years, or even decades, earlier than she would have if she had remained married. The financial cost of this accelerated institutionalization is staggering. In 2026, a standard room in a private nursing facility can easily exceed $100,000 annually. Because Patricia's individual net worth was effectively cut in half during the divorce, she will burn through her remaining liquid assets at a terrifying velocity. Once her private funds are completely exhausted, she becomes a ward of the state, entirely reliant on Medicaid to fund her continued survival. This process, known as Medicaid spend-down, is occurring at an unprecedented rate across the divorced senior demographic. State governments are completely unprepared for the sheer volume of newly impoverished, single elderly citizens who require immediate, state-funded medical intervention entirely because they lack the structural support of a marital household. The resulting tax burden required to keep these public programs solvent will inevitably fall on the shoulders of the shrinking younger working class, creating a profound generational resentment and a potential fiscal crisis at the state and federal levels. Simultaneously, we must analyze the devastating impact of the single-payer penalty on the velocity of money and general consumer spending. Consumer spending accounts for roughly 70% of the United States' gross domestic product. In a healthy economy, older demographics transition into their retirement years with significant disposable income, which they spend on travel, leisure, dining, discretionary retail, and philanthropy. This spending circulates capital through the economy, creating jobs and supporting local businesses. However, when a massive wave of the population abruptly transitions into a state of post-divorce financial survival, that discretionary spending completely evaporates. Let us look back at Thomas. After paying his inflated solo rent, his single-filer tax liabilities, and his elevated individual health insurance premiums, he has absolutely zero capital remaining for discretionary consumption. He cancels his planned European vacation. He stops eating out at local restaurants. He delays purchasing a new vehicle. The wealth that he and Patricia spent 3 decades accumulating is no longer circulating through the productive sectors of the economy. Instead, it is entirely consumed by the basic, inflated overhead of maintaining 2 separate physical existences. This localized deflationary pressure, when replicated across millions of fractured households, acts as a massive anchor on national economic growth, actively suppressing entire industries that historically relied on the stable spending patterns of wealthy retirees. We are watching the rapid, systematic dismantling of middle-class stability, orchestrated by an emotional urgency that completely ignores long-term macroeconomic reality. The very individuals who believed they were executing a carefully calculated exit strategy to secure their personal freedom are unknowingly marching into a demographic meat grinder. They are liquidating the safest, most tax-advantaged assets they own during a period of intense economic volatility, permanently handicapping their ability to weather future inflationary spikes or market corrections. But this destruction of wealth does not just haunt the immediate participants of the Great Divorce. It actively targets the financial futures of their descendants. For decades, economists have predicted the largest generational transfer of wealth in human history, assuming that the massive fortunes accumulated by the older generations would eventually flow downward to their children. But the divorce now urgency is quietly incinerating that anticipated inheritance before it can ever be transferred. How exactly does a late-stage divorce obliterate generational wealth? And what does this mean for the adult children who are suddenly forced to become the ultimate financial backstops for their impoverished parents? We will explore the terrifying collapse of the great wealth transfer and the hidden financial burdens placed on the next generation in the next part of our masterclass. For decades, financial planners and economists have been practically shouting from the rooftops about the impending arrival of the great wealth transfer. The macroeconomic models projected that as the baby boomer and older Generation X demographics entered their twilight years, an estimated $84 trillion in accumulated assets would seamlessly flow down to their Millennial and Generation Z children by the late 2040s. This anticipated inheritance was viewed as the ultimate financial salvation for younger generations who have been systematically battered by wage stagnation, exorbitant student loan debt, and an entirely unaffordable 2026 housing market. But the divorce now urgency is quietly acting as a massive incinerator, burning through this intergenerational wealth before it ever has a chance to change hands. To understand exactly how a late-stage marital dissolution destroys a family's financial legacy, we must look beyond the immediate division of assets and examine the terrifying acceleration of wealth consumption that follows. Let us map out a case study that is playing out across thousands of American households right now in 2026. Imagine a family led by Richard and Diane, a couple in their late 60s who amassed a respectable net worth of $1.5 million during their 40-year marriage. They have 2 adult children, a 34-year-old daughter named Emily and a 31-year-old son named James. Emily and James are both struggling to achieve traditional middle-class milestones. Emily is renting a cramped apartment in a high-cost city, and James is carrying $50,000 in student loan debt while trying to afford his first child. In a traditional, intact marriage scenario, Richard and Diane's $1.5 million estate would act as a fortress of stability. They would live comfortably off the compound interest and combined Social Security benefits, preserving the principal balance. Upon their eventual passing, Emily and James would each inherit roughly $750,000. That inheritance would instantly wipe out James's debt, fund his child's education, and allow Emily to finally purchase a home, fundamentally altering the trajectory of their lives. But in 2026, Richard and Diane become part of the gray divorce demographic. The $1.5 million estate is immediately slashed in half by the family court system, leaving each parent with $750,000. However, as we have already established, the sheer mathematical violence of the single-payer penalty immediately begins to drain these fractured accounts. Because Richard and Diane must now fund 2 separate mortgages, 2 separate sets of property taxes, and 2 separate, highly inflated individual healthcare plans, their cost of living skyrockets while their compounding capacity drops to zero. They are no longer living off the interest. They are actively eating into their principal just to survive the monthly overhead of the solo economy. Within a decade, the $750,000 allocated to each parent is projected to be almost entirely consumed by basic survival expenses and the terrifying costs of independent long-term care. The great wealth transfer for Emily and James completely evaporates. The structural advantage they were relying on to secure their own financial futures vanishes into the ether of family law retainer fees, inflated 2026 real estate transaction costs, and single-filer tax brackets. But the financial tragedy of the gray divorce does not end with the loss of an anticipated inheritance. It actually reverses the flow of capital, turning the adult children into the ultimate, non-consensual financial backstops for their newly impoverished parents. When a divorced senior inevitably burns through their halved retirement portfolio, they do not simply disappear from the economy. They turn to the only remaining safety net available: their offspring. This creates an invisible, crushing burden on the Millennial and Generation Z demographics. Imagine Emily receiving a phone call from her mother, Diane, 5 years post-divorce. Diane can no longer afford the rent on her solo apartment, and her out-of-pocket medical expenses have drained her remaining liquidity. Emily is now faced with an impossible, heart-wrenching choice. She must either allow her mother to fall into the brutal machinery of state-funded poverty programs, or she must absorb her mother's financial deficit into her own already strained household budget. If Emily chooses to help, she effectively sacrifices her own economic future. The cost of supporting an aging, financially compromised parent in 2026 is astronomical. Emily may be forced to move Diane into her cramped apartment, sacrificing her personal space and delaying her own plans for family formation. Or, she may have to siphon money away from her own meager retirement savings to cover Diane's prescription medications and utility bills. This phenomenon, known as the sandwich generation squeeze, is being violently exacerbated by the gray divorce trend. Adult children are finding themselves trapped between the financial demands of raising their own young children and the sudden, unanticipated burden of funding the survival of 2 separate, divorced parents. Furthermore, the emotional and logistical toll placed on these adult children completely fractures the historical dynamic of the family unit. In an intact marriage, an ailing parent is typically cared for by their spouse, buffering the adult children from the intense, daily demands of caregiving. But when an older adult is divorced and living alone, the entire logistical nightmare of managing their physical decline falls directly onto the shoulders of the children. James, who is already working 50 hours a week just to afford daycare for his newborn, suddenly finds himself acting as a part-time case manager for his father, Richard. James must navigate the labyrinthine complexities of Medicare billing, drive his father to endless medical appointments, and constantly monitor his father's cognitive state. The stress of this dual existence frequently leads to severe burnout, depression, and a complete stagnation of the adult child's own career trajectory. The legal and financial complexities of supporting a divorced parent are further compounded by the stringent requirements of government assistance programs. If Diane requires placement in an assisted living facility and has exhausted her personal funds, she must apply for Medicaid. But Medicaid involves a rigorous 5-year look-back period, designed to prevent individuals from simply transferring their wealth to their children to qualify for state aid. If Diane had attempted to give Emily a small portion of her divorce settlement a few years prior to help with rent, the state will penalize Diane, delaying her eligibility for vital medical coverage. Emily is then forced to pay out of pocket for her mother's exorbitant nursing home care during the penalty period, a cost that can easily exceed $10,000 a month in the 2026 market. This reversal of fortune completely rewrites the social contract. The wealth that was supposed to build the foundation for the next generation is instead being diverted to sustain the fragmented, highly inefficient solo lifestyles of the divorcing generation. The adult children are not only stripped of their inheritance, they are actively chained to the financial consequences of their parents' late-stage separation. They are forced to subsidize a demographic phenomenon that they had no part in creating, permanently delaying their own entry into the middle class. This brings us to a terrifying realization about the systemic nature of this crisis. If the Great Divorce epidemic is actively incinerating generational wealth, devastating the standard of living for the individuals involved, and placing an unbearable financial and logistical burden on the next generation, why does the cultural narrative surrounding midlife separation remain so overwhelmingly positive and encouraging? How has the multi-billion-dollar divorce industry successfully rebranded financial devastation as the ultimate act of self-care and personal liberation? We will dissect the psychological marketing, the cultural conditioning, and the lucrative business models that actively encourage the divorce now urgency in the next part of our masterclass. To truly understand why the divorce now urgency has captured the modern American collective consciousness, we must examine the massive multi-billion-dollar transactional apparatus that feeds upon marital dissolution. The phenomenon we are witnessing in 2026 is not merely a spontaneous cultural shift. It is a highly engineered economic marketplace driven by a massive industry that profits directly from the fragmentation of families. When an individual experiences marital dissatisfaction, they do not arrive at the decision to file for divorce in a vacuum. They are systematically targeted by sophisticated psychological marketing, mainstream media narratives, and a legal industrial complex that repackages irreversible financial destruction as the ultimate act of personal liberation, empowerment, and self-actualization. Let us look at a case study that reveals the exact mechanics of this cultural conditioning. Imagine a 51-year-old corporate administrator named Cynthia, residing in a prosperous suburb of Denver, Colorado. Cynthia has been married to her spouse for 24 years. The marriage is not abusive or high conflict. Rather, it has simply settled into a routine of emotional distance and predictability. Under the cultural frameworks of previous generations, Cynthia would likely seek marriage counseling, invest in new personal hobbies, or accept the quiet companionship of midlife. But in the digital landscape of 2026, Cynthia's online environment is saturated with a highly specific, algorithmic narrative. When she browses social media platforms, she is continuously exposed to lifestyle influencers, content creators, and self-help coaches who preach a message of radical individualism. The pervasive narrative tells her that any relationship requiring compromise or presenting emotional flatness is actively toxic and an obstacle to her personal growth. She watches short-form videos of glamorous, newly single women in their 50s who claim to have found their true purpose only after walking away from their long-term marriages. The algorithms track her engagement, feeding her an endless stream of content that validates her fleeting frustrations while completely omitting the catastrophic financial penalties that follow the legal reality of asset division. This introduces step one of the industry's pipeline: the commercialization of emotional discontent. The modern self-care industry has successfully merged with the divorce marketing apparatus. Life coaches, wellness retreats, and New Age spiritual guides have realized that a consumer undergoing a massive identity crisis is an exceptionally lucrative demographic. Cynthia is led to believe that her unhappiness is not a standard human emotional variance, but a structural defect in her marital arrangement. The marketing materials promise that a total reset of her life is the necessary prerequisite to achieving true inner peace. She is encouraged to prioritize her immediate emotional desires over her long-term financial security, utilizing catchphrases like choosing myself or living my truth to intellectually insulate herself from the mathematical realities of the single-payer economy. Step 2 is the rapid strategic handoff from the self-help ecosystem to the legal industrial complex. Once Cynthia is sufficiently convinced that immediate separation is the only path to fulfillment, she clicks on a targeted online advertisement for a local family law firm specializing in collaborative divorce or conscious uncoupling. The terminology used in these marketing campaigns is deliberately designed to minimize the perceived friction of the legal process. The advertisements utilize soft, calming aesthetics, promising a smooth, empathetic transition that protects everyone involved. They frame the consultation not as the initiation of a high-stakes legal war, but as an act of courageous self-care. When Cynthia walks into the beautifully appointed office of a high-end family law practitioner in 2026, the sales funnel closes. The attorney she meets with is an expert in behavioral psychology. They do not begin the conversation by warning Cynthia about the single-payer penalty, the 45% drop in her standard of living, or the destruction of her children's inheritance. Instead, they validate her emotional narrative, feeding her desire for validation, while securing a hefty upfront retainer fee. The legal machinery is designed to create an immediate momentum that is incredibly difficult for an individual to halt. Once the formal petition for dissolution is filed with the county clerk, the adversarial nature of the court system takes over, turning what Cynthia hoped would be a gentle, conscious uncoupling into a rigid, defensive battle for financial survival. The divorce industry operates on a structural incentive model that directly conflicts with the long-term stability of the clients it serves. Family law attorneys, forensic accountants, real estate agents specializing in marital liquidation, and private mediators all generate their primary revenues from transaction volume and billing hours. There is zero financial incentive for the legal apparatus to encourage reconciliation or to slow down the process for sober second thought. The faster the urgency can be amplified, the more rapidly retainer fees are consumed and refreshed. The industry has created an ecosystem where the emotional vulnerability of midlife adults is systematically monetized, turning private grief into corporate profit. Imagine if the automotive industry or the real estate industry marketed products by explicitly hiding the total cost of ownership. There would be massive public outrage and regulatory intervention. Yet, the divorce industry routinely markets a highly complex, wealth-destroying legal process by focusing exclusively on the idealized emotional outcome, leaving individuals to discover the structural financial traps only after the final decree is stamped and irreversible. Newly single Americans find themselves standing in their downsized, expensive 2026 apartments, looking at their halved retirement portfolios, suddenly realizing that the lifestyle influencers and high-priced attorneys who cheered them on have vanished, leaving them to bear the lifelong consequences of the single-payer penalty completely alone. This masterful rebranding of financial self-sabotage as personal growth represents one of the most successful marketing achievements of the modern era. It has created a demographic wave of individuals who are actively volunteering for economic displacement because they have been conditioned to view long-term marital commitment as a form of personal imprisonment. The cultural fabric of the nation is being rewired to favor short-term consumption and radical autonomy over the compounding strength of the multi-income family unit. The economic consequences of this narrative shift are already locking into place, ensuring that millions of aging Americans will enter their vulnerable senior years with a fraction of the capital required to sustain basic human dignity. But as this cultural and corporate machinery continues to accelerate the divorce now urgency across the United States, a critical question arises for anyone standing on the precipice of this life-altering transition. If the legal system is a wealth-devouring trap, if the tax code is filled with hidden landmines, if the single-payer economy is brutally punitive, and if the cultural narrative is a heavily commercialized illusion, how does an individual accurately evaluate their true position? Is it truly possible to navigate a midlife marital crisis without completely destroying your financial legacy, your retirement security, and the future of your children? We are about to enter the final, most critical phase of our masterclass, where we pull together every historical trend, every piece of data, and every strategic calculation to provide the definitive step-by-step survival blueprint for the modern American landscape. We will reveal the exact checklist you must execute before talking to an attorney in the conclusion of our masterclass. To navigate the treacherous waters of a late-stage marital separation without completely vaporizing your life savings, you must transition from an emotional actor into a cold, calculating strategist. You cannot afford to walk into a family law office as a victim seeking validation. You must walk in as a well-informed executive delivering a precise corporate restructure. This final phase of our masterclass outlines the exact, data-driven survival checklist that every American confronting the divorce now urgency must execute before making a single phone call to a legal professional in 2026. This blueprint is assembled from historical trends, actuarial data, and the forensic realities of high-stakes asset division. Step 1 of this survival checklist is the execution of a comprehensive, independent financial audit. Imagine a 57-year-old healthcare consultant named William, living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. William realizes his marriage has reached an irreversible endpoint, but before he shares this realization with his spouse or contacts a lawyer, he initiates a silent, meticulous data-gathering operation. William understands that in the adversarial family court system, information is the primary currency. He spends 3 weeks downloading the last 5 years of joint tax returns, every single monthly statement for all individual and joint bank accounts, credit card ledgers, brokerage summaries, and mortgage amortization schedules. Furthermore, William secures the official plan documents for his employer-sponsored 401k and his spouse's corporate pension plan. He does not rely on the simple dashboard balances displayed on his mobile banking application. He demands the actual legal descriptions of the vesting schedules, loan provisions, and early withdrawal regulations. By gathering this data upfront, William prevents a common, highly destructive scenario where an aggrieved spouse attempts to alter digital passwords, destroy paper records, or obfuscate the true scope of the marital estate once the formal legal proceedings begin. This independent audit provides William with an unassailable baseline of reality, saving him thousands of dollars in forensic accounting fees before his legal counsel even drafts the initial petition. Step 2 on the checklist is the generation of a realistic, inflation-adjusted, solo post-divorce budget. To achieve this, you must run an imagine-if scenario that strips away all optimism and forces you to confront the cold math of the single-payer penalty. William creates a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking his current joint household expenses, and then he systematically duplicates the fixed overhead costs for a solo existence. He calculates the true cost of renting a comparable 2-bedroom apartment in the 2026 Philadelphia market, factors in individual health insurance premiums outside of his family plan, and models the higher single-filer tax brackets he will occupy as an unmarried taxpayer. He applies a 30% inflation premium to his projected food and utility expenditures to account for the loss of dual consumer efficiency. Most critically, William subtracts his potential spousal support obligations directly from his solo net income, rather than relying on gross figures. This exercise reveals a sobering truth. William discovers that his current lifestyle is mathematically unsustainable on his solo income alone. This realization completely recalibrates his negotiation strategy. He realizes he cannot afford to fight for the large family home, as the cost of refinancing the property at the current high interest rates of 2026 would instantly bankrupt his solo cash flow. He shifts his strategic focus away from emotional trophies and toward maximizing his liquid, tax-advantaged cash reserves. Step 3 requires a ruthless, clear-eyed evaluation of asset liquidity versus long-term tax liabilities. As we detailed previously, $1 in a pre-tax retirement account is not equal to $1 in a post-tax savings account. William categorizes every single asset in the marital estate based on its net realization value. He sits down with the certified public accountant who specializes in matrimonial tax law, completely independent of his future divorce attorney. The accountant helps William understand that if he trades his share of the joint brokerage account for his spouse's share of a traditional IRA, he is voluntarily accepting an embedded tax penalty that will reduce his actual usable wealth by a significant percentage upon retirement. With this expert guidance, William designs a settlement proposal that aligns perfectly with current 2026 Internal Revenue Service codes. He prioritizes securing assets that carry immediate liquidity and minimal tax exposure, ensuring that he will have the cash flow necessary to fund his relocation and cover his upfront legal retainers without being forced to trigger early withdrawal penalties or slip into a high-interest consumer credit trap. Step 4 is the implementation of a strict emotional containment protocol. The family court system in the United States is optimized to monetize human anger, jealousy, and grief. Every emotional outburst, every retaliatory text message, and every refusal to compromise over minor personal property results in bilateral billing hours that enrich the legal industrial complex while impoverishing the family legacy. William makes a conscious, binding commitment to treat his divorce entirely as a corporate liquidation. He resolves never to communicate with his spouse regarding legal or financial matters via telephone or in person. Instead, he channels all communication through written channels, maintaining a professional, neutral, and courteous tone at all times. He treats every email as a document that will eventually be read aloud by a judge in a public courtroom. This radical discipline completely neutralizes the emotional volatility that family law attorneys routinely exploit to drag out litigation. By refusing to engage in petty disputes over furniture, vehicles, or holiday schedules, William deprives the adversarial system of the friction it requires to consume his capital. He steers the conversation relentlessly back to the objective financial data, forcing both legal teams to focus exclusively on a structured, equitable division of the estate. The final step on the survival checklist is the strategic selection of your legal representation. William does not hire a high-conflict litigator whose marketing materials promise to destroy the opposition or secure a victory at all costs. Case studies of late-stage divorces demonstrate that such attorneys frequently maximize their own billing hours while leaving both parties financially devastated. Instead, William interviews family law practitioners who exhibit a clear, demonstrated commitment to alternative dispute resolution, mediation, and collaborative law frameworks. He seeks an attorney who views litigation as a costly, worst-case scenario rather than the default operating procedure. During the consultation, William presents his pre-assembled financial portfolio and his realistic solo budget. He explicitly informs the attorney that his primary goal is the maximum preservation of the marital estate's net wealth and a swift, out-of-court settlement. He demands transparency regarding billing practices, requiring a detailed estimation of costs for each phase of the negotiation, and he retains the final authority over all strategic decisions. William successfully positions himself as the manager of his legal team, rather than a passive passenger in a wealth-devouring machine. By executing this definitive checklist, you effectively insulate your future from the systemic forces driving the gray divorce epidemic. You transform a process designed for economic destruction into a calculated, manageable transition. You protect your compounding efficiency, preserve the generational wealth intended for your descendants, and safeguard your basic human dignity against the single-payer penalty of the modern economy. The urgency to divorce now must never be allowed to outpace the urgency to prepare. But as we conclude this comprehensive masterclass on changing demographics and the economic realities of modern separation, we are standing on the edge of an even greater, more systemic cultural disruption. The financial collapse of the traditional American household is merely the first domino to fall in a massive interconnected chain reaction that is actively rewriting the rules of wealth, real estate, and survival in the late 2020s. There is an entirely different, hidden demographic trend quietly unfolding beneath the surface of the corporate workforce, one that will fundamentally dictate who thrives and who perishes in the coming economic cycle. What is this silent professional migration, and how will it completely alter your earning power before the decade ends? We are diving directly into that urgent reality in our next comprehensive video series, and you cannot afford to miss the first breakdown.